Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Joke Rogers in Lagos. Here's what's coming up on the program. Global reactions continue to pour in over U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff announcement as several affected countries set reciprocal levies. France and UK call on Russia to accept ceasefire deal now on the war in Ukraine. Plus, at least dozens of Palestinians have been killed in an Israeli airstrike on a school. Welcome again, everyone. A global response has begun to U.S. President Donald Trump's trade tariffs announced on Wednesday. Beginning with China, the country says it will impose reciprocal 34% tariffs on all imports from the United States from April 10, making good on a promise to strike back after U.S. President Donald Trump escalated a global trade war. On Wednesday, Mr. Trump unveiled an additional 34% tariff on all Chinese goods imported into the United States, in a move poised to cause a major reset of relations and worsen trade tensions between the world's two largest economies. China's State Council Tariff Commission said in a statement announcing its retaliatory tariffs that the U.S. is not in line with international trade rules, and this seriously undermines China's legitimate rights and interests. The statement further calls it a typical unilateral bullying practice. Since returning to power in January, Mr. Trump had already levied 2 tranches of 10% additional duties on all Chinese imports, which the White House said was necessary to stem the flow of illicit fentanyl from the country to the U.S. Combined with pre-existing tariffs, that means Chinese goods arriving in the United States would be effectively subject to tariffs, as well as over 54% of China's retaliation against the latest round of U.S. tariffs is more sweeping than its earlier reciprocal actions. And for the European Union, the representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Kaja Kallas, reiterates that there are no winners in trade wars in response to questions about U.S. President Donald Trump's reciprocal tariffs. This is ahead of the NATO foreign ministers meeting in Brussels. When asked whether the U.S. tariffs are in line with Article 2 of the North Atlantic Treaty, Ms. Kallas responded by saying, all these tariffs are not a very positive development. NATO's Article 2 states that parties will contribute towards the further development of peaceful and friendly international relations by strengthening their free institutions, by bringing about a better understanding of the principles upon which these institutions are founded, and by promoting conditions of stability and well-being.
As I've said before, there are no winners in trade wars, and of course all these tariffs are not very positive development, because if we have like natural partners like America and Europe are, if we have a trade war, then our adversaries are looking on the side. So of course our trade people are dealing with trade negotiations to have a more positive outcome of this, but of course we are also ready to defend our interests. It is clear that it raises prices for the consumers and companies, and it eventually is not good. But on the defense side, we really need to move with proposals. Of course, we need to also develop our economies to be able to fund that defense spending that we need to do.
In the meantime, French President Emmanuel Macron says the European Union must not rule out anything to retaliate against the so-called Liberation Day tariffs announced by his U.S. counterpart. President Macron has lashed out against Mr. Trump's decision to impose the so-called reciprocal tariffs on virtually every country, calling the move brutal and unfounded, and proposing a temporary halt in future European investments in America. The pause, he said, should last until we have clarified things with the United States. Mr. Macron said this during a meeting with French industry representatives calling for collective solidarity. During his speech, Mr. Macron did not hold back against Mr. Trump's unprecedented initiative, which will hit the European Union with a 20% rate starting on April 9. Separately, the bloc will face 25% rates on exports of steel, aluminium and cars, which are already in force. Well, the EU is preparing its countermeasures after the White House announced those reciprocal tariffs on the bloc's exports to the United States. Let's get more on this. And joining us is DW correspondent Chiponda Chimbelu in Berlin. Chiponda, great to see you again this evening. What kind of response can we expect from the European Union?
Well, the responses from the EU's two biggest economies, France and Germany, are very clear, and they want the bloc to be aggressive in its answer to the tariffs. The outgoing German economy minister, Robert Habeck, said that this is an opportunity for the continent to look for like-minded partners and forge new alliances. And the French president, Emmanuel Macron, stated that companies from his country should halt investments in the United States until European countries have a coordinated response. While Brussels has made it clear it is open to negotiations, the EU is under increasing pressure to be more aggressive. Now, since the change in the White House, the shift in rhetoric from Washington has caused Europeans to question the transatlantic partnership due to negotiations on the war in Ukraine between the Trump administration and the Kremlin, and questions over shared values and trade tariffs, of course.
Right, and there seems to be a lot of concerns raised. How will the tariffs affect the EU economy?
Well, the EU is the US's biggest commerce partner, and the value in trade between them is nearly $1 trillion. And last year, just over a fifth of EU exports went to the United States. So the tariffs could, of course, be very damaging for both markets, and they will definitely hurt Europe's biggest economy, Germany, because it is export dependent. And some estimates say Germany's GDP could shrink by as much as 0.5% as a result of the tariffs. Now, industry representatives here have been saying that the tariffs are an attack on the international trade system and global supply chains. And they say the European economy shouldn't become a ball in the fight over geopolitical interests. But companies aren't waiting for a response, and some are already making changes to their supply chains and planning to move production to parts of the United States.
Right, and it was a matter of time for many economies around the world. So what can we expect for the global economy?
Well, the main concern is that the tariffs will lead to a global recession. If they remain and there are more trade barriers in the form of countermeasures, production costs will rise, and that will lead to inflation. Now, consumers across the world will buy less, and that will hamper economic growth pretty much everywhere. And that is what economists and European policymakers have been warning about. Even U.S. consumers will lose out. Now, moving production back to the United States doesn't make sense for low-end products. Now, let's take Lesotho in Southern Africa, for instance. It has been hit by 50% tariffs on its exports to the United States, and that is more than double what the EU is facing. And the idea that production for Basotho textile products could be moved to the United States doesn't make any sense because labor costs there are much higher in the United States. And of course, Lesotho is such a small market that it wouldn't benefit the U.S. economy if it tried to balance its trade with the United States. Now, the idea that international trade is a zero-sum game doesn't add up, and that is why many economists are warning that a trade war is a lose-lose situation.
Thanks again, Chiponda. Elsewhere, Argentine President Javier Milei has announced that he will push for a series of legislative reforms in the country that should help alleviate the effects of the newly imposed U.S. tariffs. He announced this during a brief speech at the American Patriots Gala in Miami, as all exports to the United States from Argentina will now face a 10% tariff, the baseline levy for all countries taking exports to the country. The politician will announce that he instructed his foreign minister, Gerardo Waitin, to negotiate with the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, a trade agreement with the U.S. In March, the U.S. reinstated a full 25% tariff on steel imports and increased tariffs on aluminum imports to 25% for all countries, including Argentina. The government has welcomed the Liberation Day 10% tariff, considering it low compared to other countries. However, this same tariff has also been applied to other South American nations such as Colombia, Brazil, Chile, and Peru. Meanwhile, fear and anxiety are running high in Windsor, Ontario, after car maker Stellantis announced it will temporarily shut down its assembly plants in the Canadian border city next week as a result of U.S. President Donald Trump's car tariffs. About 4,500 people are employed at the plant, and they say the temporary pause in operations was kind of expected. However, there's worry about what's to come. It's a feeling that's echoed across Windsor, the heart of Canada's automobile sector, and just a bridge away from the U.S. state of Michigan. For decades, the two regions worked together across the shared U.S.-Canada border to build some of North America's most popular cars, like the Ford F-150. Those working in Windsor's auto sector who spoke to the BBC on Thursday say they are worried about the days ahead, and now that the U.S. has implemented a 25% tariff on all foreign-made vehicles, it could be worse. For Canada, the tariff will be reduced by half for cars that are made with 50% U.S.-made components or more. Well, responding to this building up of anxiety among Canadians, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced that Canada will hit back with its own tariffs. Like the U.S., Canada will slap a 25% tariff on American-made cars sold in Canada. Vehicles that were produced in compliance with the existing North American Free Trade Agreement between Canada, the U.S. and Mexico will face lower taxes, with a tariff applying only to the non-Canadian components of the car. Unlike the U.S., Canada will not be applying its tariffs on automotive parts. Mr. Carney also said that the Canadian government will work to exempt auto producers from these tariffs if they choose to maintain their production and investment in Canada.
The U.S. administration, while not specifically targeting Canada, will rupture the global economy and adversely affect global economic growth. The global economy is fundamentally different today than it was yesterday. The system of global trade anchored on the United States that Canada has relied on since the end of the Second World War, a system that, while not perfect, has helped to deliver prosperity for our country for decades, is over. Our old relationship of steadily deepening integration with the United States is over. The 80-year period when the United States embraced the mantle of global economic leadership, when it forged alliances rooted in trust and mutual respect, and championed the free and open exchange of goods and services, is over. Well, this is a tragedy. It is also the new reality. We must respond with both purpose and force. We are a free, sovereign, and ambitious country. We are masters in our own home.
Joining us on the program is Olufemi Johnson, a senior executive in the manufacturing industry in Canada. He joins us from Saskatoon. Thank you so much for joining us today on the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Right, so assessing Mr. Trump's announcement, how significant is the impact of the tariff announcement on the Canadian automobile sector?
Well, we've been trying to assess things. As you know, when he gave these general global tariff, he kind of exempted Canada and Mexico due to the uniqueness and the agreement that Canada and Mexico has with the USMCA and all of that. But on the tariffs on aluminum, stainless steel, and for the auto industry, generally we believe that it's a double-edged sword in the sense that it's going to take some bites just as we will. Now, if you understand the supply chain for auto industry in North America, you find out that nobody makes it all, especially between the US and Canada. We have an under plant somewhere there in Ontario that makes other cars. A substantial amount of the parts that end up in those cars come from Ohio, comes from California, comes from New York, and there are a lot of Toyota parts and Toyota car making in the US. A significant portion of that comes from a significant portion of the parts that end up in making those cars come from across the border from Ontario. So at the end of the day, one of the things we're beginning to juggle on, and what a lot of professionals industry experts are looking at is how do we even quantify this tariff? Are we going to be looking at only the portion that is imported from each side of the border to make the cars that we eventually make, or are we just going to be looking at after the car is complete, just with the tariff as it crosses the border? So all of that is still ongoing in terms of conversation. But generally, yeah, it's gonna affect because a few of these car makers, especially for example, General Motors with their Ford plant in Canada already bowing to the pressure to say, okay, they're going to be making more in the US. So we expect to believe that at the end of the story, it will be a two-edged sword. The American side would have feel a pinch as well. And generally speaking, since McCartney came in and in the last few weeks, somehow Trump's tone towards Canada has been a little bit softer, if I would use that word. He extended the hands of fellowship to Kanye by calling him. When Kanye just came in, he didn't even reach out to Trump at all. He went to Europe straight and never went to Trump. Trump had to come to him to say, "Look, let's talk," and all of that, which is a positive sign. And with his global tariff, he exempted Canada and Mexico, which is also a good thing. But the auto tariffs and the stainless steel is something that we still need to talk about, and we believe it would affect on both sides of the border because nobody actually makes it all across both sides of the border in terms of cars, in terms of even the stainless steel. Some are made from here and then used in the US. Some are made in the US and used over here. But the reality still remains that US is a very big economy, then more than 10 times bigger than Canada. There's no argument about that. And they hold the bigger side of the stick at the end of it all. They'll be able to adjust, even if they have some short-term discomfort. They should be able to adjust. That's the belief. But we in Canada as well, and our government and those of us that are speaking to them, and we're beginning to quickly move on to say, look, we can continue to rely on this partnership, this brotherhood, if I could say that, between Canada and the US, and start to look for other friends across the border. And we're doing a lot of work on that already to ensure that as the future unfolds, we'll put ourselves in a place where we don't just make you an enemy just because you're an enemy of the US. We don't just stop talking to you just because the US doesn't want it. We need to start to build our own personality, our own relationship, understanding that the US, in the final analysis, it's a different country.
Right, and outside of Canada, it's a worldwide tariff, if I can put it that way, and some of those majorly affected are China and EU. You've spoken about, other American countries like Mexico. We've talked about Argentina and all of that. But how will you rate the response of, China and, of course, Europe, the European Union to these tariffs and the reciprocal nature of, what they have also announced that the action they will take against the United States?
Yeah, and yes, and I agree with that. I mean, in this whole game, the biggest players are also China and Europe, anyway. So, and of course, China is not new to Trump in terms of tariff and counter tariff. If you recall, the first time Trump came, it was between China and the US, and they are the biggest economies. And of course, China has responded quickly, just as we expected. And of course, we expect that will impact a lot especially on the agricultural produce like corn and soya and all of that, which comes significantly from the US into China. We believe that China will be able to take the shock. They're big enough to be able to do that, and they're influential enough within the global space to find other partners, no doubt about that. Europe is, apart from the fact that it has this very strong alliance with the US in terms of protection, military-wise, and all of that, they're also highly integrated into the US in terms of the market and all of that. For give an example, most of the German cars, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, they're sold more in the US than they're sold in Europe. And I don't think they have any significant operation in the US. They have some some plants where they put together cars, but they keep the major manufacturing in Europe, in Germany, and a few other places. Yeah, but they would also be able to. I know they're beginning to talk about negotiations. For example, UK has made it clear that it's not retaliating; it's just going to go into negotiation. Um, Europe is going to retaliate, and they've started doing that, but they also want to quickly go into a negotiation. There's no doubt. I mean, we are not pretending about the fact that we know that US is a huge economy. It's an economy that everybody wants to play in. There's money in the US. You can't play in a global space without being in the US. We all know that, you know. But for Europe, they would have to find a way balance between those two. And to some extent, I mean, if we look at especially in auto, Europe seems to have kept a lot of its manufacturing there in Europe while just selling to America. You know, you see more of the maybe Japanese cars manufacturing more in the United States outside of Ford and the GM brand and the American brand. It's more of the Honda, the Toyota, the Lexus being made around here than you would see and the BM, the Benz, the Audi and all of that. So yeah, so that is, and meanwhile, this is the biggest market. So maybe there might be some points for those on the Trump side in terms of that. But Europe would ultimately have to have some negotiation, giving some, because in reality, I'm not very certain that Europe will have much that's going to be holding against the United States apart from farm produce. They can't stop buying their war weapons. And that's the only place they can buy their weapons from, except they want to go buy in China or Russia, which they wouldn't. And I know that war weapons are the biggest sales from the US to Europe. In terms of alcohol, the US buys more of the alcohols from Europe than Europe buys from them. The US buy more cars from Europe than Europe buys from them. So Europe will need to come and make friends with them somehow and give them some. That's my personal opinion. But it's going to be over time, right? It's going to be over time. It's going to be over time. I don't see them being able to eat US so strongly that's going to affect them like China would be able to.
Right, and let's bring it here to Nigeria. With the tariff and exchange rate challenges, how would Nigerian businesses, even begin to think of coping with the combined effects of, labor costs, the 14% U.S. tariff, the existing 27% Nigerian tariff, and of course, the exchange rates disparities?
That's a big one. and I say that it's big. First, I started by asking myself, what does Nigeria actually sell into the U.S.? For example, our oil. Our oil doesn't particularly come to the U.S. U.S. doesn't depend on us for much of our oil. Our oil goes to China and these other places per se. So U.S. is almost self-sufficient. I know recently there was this conversation that Dangote was going to send some aviation fuel to some U.S. businesses. Those kind of small businesses would occur. But typically, yeah, most of our oil doesn't go to them. So what do we actually sell into the U.S.? I think my answer became, looking at my own surrounding and environment, my answer came down to groceries and local Nigerian groceries, and that's big business for us because if you go everywhere in North America, go to California, New York, come to Toronto, Ontario, anywhere, you see a lot of what we call African stores where we in the diaspora depend on a lot of the things that they bring from Nigeria for our daily needs. We're used to eating things that's come from home. You want gari, you want any of these Nigerian delicacies, you go to them, and these businesses are so many, and putting them together, it's a big business because a lot of that comes from Nigeria. Now, apart from those ones, and maybe clothes, a lot of us wanted to buy natives and all of that to go to most of these people who ultimately bring it from Nigeria. That's a big and the most visible business to me. Grocery stores, which we call African stores, we're expecting to quickly go up and become more expensive from there, especially in the US. And what I see playing out is that some of them might start to play smart, rather than making Nigeria your origin of product origin, you go and make it Togo or make it. I'm not sure what kind of sanctions for tariffs got placed on Ghana, Togo, and all of that. I'm not very sure, but it's not impossible that you start to see some of these things coming in from those places. Basically go across the border from Nigeria, repackage it, and all of that. But the biggest one is that for those of us Nigerians or diasporans, especially from African origin, that do a lot of depending on our daily sustenance and the basic things from a lot of these African stores, we immediately start to see significant price increases, even though those things are already expensive compared to regular groceries. So that's a good one. That's the one that would quickly come to mind. But generally speaking, however, and in a larger spectrum, I've always had this opinion that the concept of the World Trade Organization and how it brings in the overall concept of trade, including labor, is no longer balanced. That has never been balanced. Now, if you go a little bit into history, how did we get here in the first place? Industrial revolution. The big economies started to do things much faster. They're able to make much more than they need. And then the World Trade Organization came in an attempt to balance how things could be traded across borders, right? And in doing that, they were only considerate of geography. The United States, I want to sell a pen across to you in Europe. You make pen as well, but you need to create space so that I can sell mine in your market. I would also create space so that you can sell yours in my market. You know, the concept, that was the concept of the whole of the trade agreements and all of that, you know, as the Industrial Revolution came, as we went into the Second World War and after the Second World War. But in today's world, trade has become, even more global, such that those of us in Africa, and especially those of us that have provided the immigrants that run this economy, need to start to redefine what global trade is. You know, I give an example. As a family lives in Canada, you are there in Nigeria. Let's assume that for whatever reason, if let's assume, okay, let's just use this hypothetical example. Let's use the UK for example. Let's assume you live in the UK. Femi is in Nigeria, and you were born at the same time. You started studying there in the UK. I started studying there in Nigeria. After some time, I get across to maybe tertiary institution level. I go to my village. My villagers put money together for me. I went to borrow money. I sold the father's land. I sold the statue of the gods of my community. Gathered some money. Then came to the UK to join you, to go to the same university as you. I paid £10,000 for school fees. You paid £2,000 for school fees. At the end of the story, we both graduate, and we're both now working in the same company there in the UK. We both pay taxes to the government of the UK. I believe that in the overall narrative, considering the global nature of market, the global nature of economy, and the fact that we've become more a single village, that the concept of labor, there should be some level of repatriation back to home countries and for immigrants, such that we can then look at global trade, not just as a function of geography or place of production, but also as a function of the elements that go into production. You know, I believe that in that circumstance, a family should be able to repatriate part of its income through some form of tax back to where it was trained originally, back to where it was educated originally, you know. Because at the end of the day, when you make these products that we both work in the same organization, whatever the product we make, it's been sold all over the world. It's been sold maybe back into Nigeria, for example. I work in the dairy industry. If we make dairies, most of the significant portion of the dairy that comes out of Europe ends up in what we kind of consume there in Africa and in Nigeria. You know, so we as a continent, as the people, we need to go back into this to redefine what world trade should be about, to take it away from just geographies, just saying, oh, you work within my economy, I sell things into yours. If I don't want your things in my economy, I put a tariff on it, it becomes more expensive. And then if I need to retaliate, I go back to my people, I give them some subventions or I give them some rebates so that things can become cheaper. And then between us, we start to haggle and start to go back and forth, which is basically what we're doing now. But we need to redefine the elements of global trade so that even labor becomes a conversation. Because I tell you, there's nothing happening in the global space that countries like Nigeria, India, they are actually significant participants within the global space in terms of labor, in terms of running these businesses. I mean, if you come here to the West and go anywhere, most of the people that run these businesses, lead these businesses, even on the shop floor that do the hard work, are immigrants, you know, a significant portion of them Nigerians or Indian. So we need to bring this portion into that conversation as we move within the overall global space.
Right. I must thank you for this very, long conversation. Thank you for your time and for explaining all these. I'm sure more explanations will come up in the next couple of days because the conversation is not about to end. Olufemi Johnson, thanks again for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. I'll be happy to come again if you ask. Thank you very much.
We certainly will. Thank you. The Trump administration has fired the head of both the National Security Agency and the U.S. Cyber Command. The removal of General Timothy Hugh comes amid what appears to be a wider purge of top security officials at the agency and the White House. Democrats have said that they are deeply disturbed by the move and say it jeopardizes national security. It's not clear why he was removed, but it comes after a meeting between President Donald Trump and far-right activist Laura Loomer on Wednesday. Ms. Loomer reportedly urged Mr. Trump to fire specific employees whom she suspected lacked support for his agenda. Meanwhile, Mr. Trump has denied that Ms. Loomer played a role in the firings. Before the firings were reported, Mr. Trump told reporters he would get rid of any staff deemed to be disloyal. In the meantime, a Kremlin envoy has praised the Trump administration for hearing Russia's position on many issues after 2 days of meetings in Washington that marked the first time in years that a senior Russian official had traveled to the United States for talks with American counterparts. The envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, met in the White House on Tuesday with President Trump's senior aide on Russia negotiations, Steve Witkoff. Mr. Dmitriev, the head of Russia's Sovereign Wealth Fund, and Mr. Vladimir Putin's special representative for investment and economic cooperation, said he held further meetings on Thursday with key members of the Trump administration without identifying them. The meeting between Kirill Dmitriev and Steve Witkoff was apparently the first time in years that a senior Russian official had traveled to the United States for talks with an American counterpart. President Donald Trump was asked about Russian envoy Kirill Dmitriev's visit to the U.S. as he spoke with the media aboard Air Force One on Thursday.
We do. We have an envoy from Russia. We're talking about it. We'd like to see that stop as soon as possible because thousands of people are being killed a week. Soldiers, mostly soldiers, and Ukrainian soldiers and Russian soldiers. And you're losing 2,000, 3,000 sometimes a week. So we're spearheading the drive to get it done. Europe has not been successful in dealing with President Putin, but I think I will be successful.
Russia has discussed ways to boost military ties with the Sahel countries, promising to train their troops and supply weapons as it seeks to expand its operations in the Sahel West African countries. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said on Thursday after talks with his counterparts from Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger Republic that Moscow stands ready to help strengthen their military and security forces. Mali's Foreign Minister Abdoulaye Diop echoed Mr. Lavrov's comments, stating that his country views Ukraine as a terrorist state, adding that Russia and Mali have common views on fighting insecurity and terrorism. Mali's government cut diplomatic ties with Ukraine last year over allegations that Kyiv aided an attack by armed groups in northern Mali in July, in which dozens of Russian mercenaries and Malian soldiers were killed by militants and rebels. More on the Ukraine war. UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy and French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot are accusing Russia of flip-flopping on peace talks with Ukraine during a press conference in Brussels on Friday. Mr. Lammy also says the UK is stepping up its defense spending and accepting a bigger share of the burden amid calls from the US to boost its military budget up to 5%. Meanwhile, Mr. Barrett says Russia owes an answer to the US after its mediation efforts for a ceasefire proposal with Ukraine.
This NATO gathering of foreign ministers.
Over the past 3 weeks, Russia has been flip-flopping, continuing its strikes on energy infrastructure, continuing its war crimes. Today, Russia owes an answer to the United States that have worked very hard to come up with a mediation effort and a ceasefire proposal. They have to come up with an answer. It has to be yes, it has to be no, and it has to be a quick answer. In this context, and on last Thursday, coalition partners entrusted President Macron, Prime Minister Starmer, with the role of coordinating their efforts. Effort in the direction of building up support to Ukraine to add pressure on Russia. Our teams, alongside teams of our colleagues of other coalition countries, are working to prepare for efforts needed to make sure that the peace, whenever it's reached, can be lasting.
We're united as two countries, and we will leave this NATO gathering of foreign ministers more united than we've been for many years in the face of the threats that face us. It is still the case that our judgment is that Putin continues to obfuscate, continues to drag his feet. He could accept a ceasefire now. He continues to bombard Ukraine, its civilian population, its energy supplies. We see you, Vladimir Putin. We know what you are doing, and that is why we are pledged to continue to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position, militarily, economically, and with the humanitarian context that they need.
Elsewhere, at least 33 Palestinians have been killed and more than 100 wounded in Israeli airstrikes on 3 schools housing displaced people in the Tufa neighborhood of Gaza City. And that's according to local officials. Gaza's government media office said in a statement that 29 people, including 18 children, that's more than half of them, were killed and more than 100 were injured when Israeli air raids hit the Dar al-Kham school turned shelter on Thursday. The school was hit with at least 4 missiles. And elsewhere, at least 4 people were also killed in an Israeli attack on the Fad school in the same area of Gaza City, which was also sheltering displaced families. The Israeli military said it struck a command center in Gaza City that had been used by Hamas fighters to plan and execute attacks against Israeli civilians and soldiers. It was unclear whether it was the same attack that targeted a school. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has deployed a team to assess a site in Khan Yunis for the displaced people. The families that have had to move continuously because of the war share that the area was struck the previous evening, killing a family and injuring 8 children. The same site was struck again just 15 minutes after the UN team left, killing another 3 people, including a child.
Families continue to move from Rafah, from all over Rafah, and coming to areas of Khan Yunis and Mawasi. And we're talking today to families in a site in Khan Yunis, where several hundred families are now living, and 160 of them have just arrived without anything. They came under fire, they were being shot at. And I'm standing here on a site where a tent was just yesterday, where a family was living just yesterday, and at 11 o'clock in the evening, it was hit with a bomb and killed 3 people, a family, mother, father, and a child, and injured 8 other children, including one 5-year-old girl who lost her leg. The people here have just told me that they've been looking for her leg since the explosion. They haven't found it still. The impact this war is having on children is astonishing and abhorrent. These killings must stop, and civilians must always be protected.
Outside of that war, the first humanitarian flight by an aid organization to land in Myanmar following the devastating earthquake of March 28, UNICEF has flown in 18 metric tons of emergency supplies to support children and families in urgent need across the worst affected areas. Supported by the European Union, the shipment from UNICEF's global supply hub in Copenhagen includes emergency health kits, medical supplies, tents and recreation kits. The supplies will be transported to the affected areas for distribution to children and families in desperate need. Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has sounded the alarm over the dire situation in Myanmar and announced the immediate deployment of top UN officials to the region following last week's earthquake, which he said supercharged the suffering of the nation already gripped by crisis. South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol has been removed from office after a constitutional court voted unanimously to uphold his impeachment. Mr. Yoon was suspended from duty in December after being impeached by Parliament following his failed attempt to impose martial law. However, his removal was met with tears of joy and sadness among his critics and his supporters, who had gathered in various parts of Seoul to watch the verdict live. In his first remarks after the verdict, he says he's truly sorry for failing to live up to the people's expectations. A snap election to vote for his replacement will be held on June 3 this year. Nations of the world, including Nigeria, have committed to set aside 15% of resources and opportunities for people living with disability, who make up 15% of the population. This commitment, known as the Berlin Declaration, is the outcome of the 2025 Global Disability Summit in Berlin, Germany. Our correspondent, Kayode Okikiolu, reports.
It is said that 1 in 6 of us suffers from significant disability. And the big question is, what is the 5 doing to ensure that that 1 is included? The Third Global Disability Summit, GDS 2025, is co-organized by the governments of Jordan and Germany, alongside the International Disability Alliance. The summit brings together leaders to discuss the rights and well-being of people with disabilities worldwide. Chancellor Olaf Scholz calls for stronger support for people with disabilities, saying every country, rich or poor, must do more.
It is in our economic interest, it is our democratic duty, and it is politically expedient. For the first time, agree on a specific funding target. 15% for the 15% is the message of the Berlin Declaration on Global Disability Inclusion.
King Abdullah II of Jordan highlights the crisis in Gaza, saying it has the highest number of child amputees per capita.
Gaza has the highest number of child amputees per capita in the world, along with massive numbers of injured adults. Medical facilities have been destroyed, and rethinking old ways.
The guiding principle for issues of inclusion is expression. Nothing about us without us. But what does that 1 in 6 person living with disability want the other 5 to know?
We are part of the society and we need to be taken into account.
We also have the ability to doing anything in the community. That's why we want to say that don't look at our disability, but you must look at our ability.
Members of JONAPAID are advocating for the Nigerian government to fulfill the 15 for 15 Berlin commitment.
Amit Borbela from Hungary. She was born without limbs and does everything with her feet.
I don't feel I have a significant disability. There are others, and they have multiple disabilities.
The Minister of State for Humanitarian Affairs, Tanko Sununu, is representing the Nigerian government here. On the sidelines, he is joined by the leader of the nation's delegation, Mr. Jake Apeli, to speak on the Nigerian situation.
Togetherness that you saw today with the Honorable Minister and persons with disability, you will agree with me that doesn't happen back home. But we need to see it happen in Nigeria within our space, where access to policymakers with strong political will actually happen in tangible form.
We have an act that establishes both the commission and also prohibiting the discrimination against people with disability. So as we are working, we have given commitment that we ensure that operationality of that act is intensified, and ensure that whatever we are doing, we are taking the interest, the earning and aspiration of people with disability, in terms of giving them access to employment, in terms of giving them access to education, in terms of giving them access to workspaces, and also making a lot of infrastructural reconstructions so that they can be taken into concern.
Well, the conversations have been had, commitments have been made, but how well will these commitments be implemented? Well, that's what we wait to see until the next edition of the Global Disability Forum. From Station Berlin, in Berlin, Germany, venue of a Global Disability Summit 2025, Kayode Okikulu, reporting for Channels Television News.
At least 7 people have died after tornadoes and violent winds ripped through the U.S. South. A series of storms expected to continue for days takes hold. Deaths were recorded in western Tennessee, Missouri, and Indiana on Wednesday and Thursday in areas where homes were flattened and debris flew miles high. The toll could rise in what the National Weather Service described as once-in-a-generation storms in flood warning issued on Thursday. Dozens of severe weather alerts, including tornado watches and flash flood warnings, have been issued from Texas to Pennsylvania. The NWS says the storm system will threaten significant life-threatening flash flooding until Saturday. On Thursday, tornado warnings, the highest level alert, were issued in parts of Texas, Louisiana, and West Virginia, with tornado watches in parts of Arkansas, Mississippi, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Flash flood warnings were also in effect in Mississippi and Kentucky areas, where states of emergency have also been declared, and in West Virginia as well. Bulldozers have already been deployed in many of these areas, clearing mounds of debris and rubble amid downed power lines. U.S. President Donald Trump has unveiled a $5 million gold card visa aimed at attracting wealthy foreign investors. The new visa pathway offers permanent U.S. residency and a route to citizenship in exchange for a $5 million investment. The gold-colored card features Mr. Trump's image and is set to replace the current EB-5 visa program. Showing off the new card aboard Air Force One, Mr. Trump said, "For $5 million, this could be yours." That was the first of the cards. You know what the card is? It's a gold card, the Trump card. Mr. Trump added that the U.S. would start issuing the card in less than 2 weeks. When asked who the first buyer was, Mr. Trump responded, "It's him."
The day before, the U.S. President
Well, the major changes in the U.S. federal government is creating hesitation and even fear in many Americans. Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey took a stand earlier this week to share his opinion, the letters and concerns his office has received from Americans from across the country. Our Washington correspondent, Maria Bird, has more.
The day before, the U.S. President Donald Trump made the historic tariff announcements, Senator Cory Booker took on an act of what many are calling an act of political stamina as he made history and filibustered the floor of the Senate for 25 hours.
Very sore and weary and tired, but I'm enormously grateful for a lot of folks who sent me their very, very personal stories. They gave me a chance to speak to the pain, hurt, fear, anger, demands of a lot of Americans. I'm so grateful to a lot of my colleagues and a lot of the help that people gave me to do this. I didn't know how long I could go, but I'm so grateful that I lasted for 25 hours.
Senator Booker spent those hours providing accounts from Americans that have lost their jobs, experienced deportation, health care, and economic crises over the last few months, calling for an end and objection to the executive orders and actions set forth by President Trump and his administration.
I am here in this body because of past generations that fought to uphold the Constitution, not because the Constitution was real to them, but because they brought reality and hope and love and promise to the Constitution. They were Americans that said, like Langston Hughes, America never was America to me, but I swear this oath, America will be. They loved this country so much even when it didn't love them back. I am here because of that.
While Democrats have recognized him and applauded him as a hero, many are asking, where do we go from here? And how can we address the anticipation of increased food and pharmaceutical costs for Americans? From Washington, Maria Bird, Channel Television News.
Well, former Minister of Tourism and Cultural Affairs of Sierra Leone, Mr. Diminatu Pratt, is advocating for cultural diplomacy as a catalyst for sustainable peace in Africa. She was speaking at the 14th edition of the Pan-African Leadership Symposium and Awards 2025, holding in Nigeria, while delivering keynote address which centered on the theme, the role of good governance and alternative dispute resolution mechanisms for consolidating peaceful coexistence in Africa. She emphasized the power of cultural diplomacy as a form of soft power that can promote mutual understanding, resolve conflicts and bridge ideological divides across the African continent. She further notes that sustainable peace is not merely the absence of war, but requires the presence of justice, equity, well-being and shared values, hallmarks of what is known as positive peace. As spring unfolds across South Korea, the historic city of Gyeongju is set to host its annual Cherry Blossom Festival on April 4 and 6, drawing visitors eager to witness the magnificent cherry blossoms in full bloom. Drone footage captures about 9,000 cherry trees lining the shores of Bumun Lake, transforming the historic landscape into a breathtaking sea of pink and white blossoms. A beautiful way to close the world today for the week. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Jokia Rogers.